Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new Securing Bridges podcast. You're about to join Alyssa Miller as she sits down with senior and executive security leaders to share stories of success and failure while working across business teams. It's time to build and secure the bridge to the business. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
All right, everybody, welcome aboard once again. We are on episode 5, I believe. You'll have to check me if I'm wrong on that, but that's what I think we are. We're back here at Securing Bridges. We are talking about how do we build a better message in security? How do we connect everything that we're trying to do from a cybersecurity perspective back to the business? Because at the end of the day, you know, they're kind of the reason we get paid. So if you haven't checked out any of these episodes so far, welcome aboard. For those of you that have been here before, super glad to have you back. And week 5, we have yet another amazing guest. So I was joking with our next guest before the show about the fact that one of the reasons that I wanted him on is because he will call me on my crap more than anybody, which I love. So that's, in addition to being amazingly intelligent and a super awesome person just in the community, hey, I had to get somebody on here who's going to call me out and tell me when I'm wrong. And that person is none other than Jeff Mann. Hey, Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Alyssa. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me to your show. And I'm in a grumpy mood this afternoon anyway, so fair warning. I'll try to be nice, but I'm grumpy about lots of things all the time anyway. And it's not just you. I'll call just about anybody's crap out. And I'd like to think that people are allowed to call me out on my crap as well. It's I try to be even keeled in that sense. And so yeah, here I am.
Let's talk and all. Yeah, it makes sense. So very cool. Well, so let's start with, I mean, there might be like 1 or 2 people out there who haven't heard of you yet. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, come on, how do you operate in security and not know who Jeff is? But just in case, can you just start off with a little bit about you? We'd love to understand, where your perspectives are coming from, shall we say?
Who am I and why am I here? A lot of people don't know who I am because I suck at self-promotion, or I don't care, one of the two. And it also depends which segment of this thing that we call the cybersecurity world you play in. I happen to be, my daytime job happens to be as what's called a qualified security assessor, a QSA. So I work in that 3-letter field known as PCI. I've been doing that for as long as PCI has been around. But I'm not your average QSA, and that's because I had over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity, and we didn't call it that back then, by the way, before I started doing the whole PCI thing. So I've been in the business almost 40 years. So quickly, who am I? Where do I come from? I'll try to be succinct. Born a hacker, always a hacker. Didn't realize that until a couple years ago. Got into computer and network and internet security at the very beginning. I happened to be working for a DoD agency called NSA at the time. I am, my claim to fame within the hacker community is I was part of the what came to be known as the first NSA Red Team. I was sort of their business development manager. I don't take claim for starting it, but I certainly do claim that I was the one that sort of made it a thing and made it, tried to model it like a practice. And we had customers and we had services that we offered internally at first and within the DoD, by extension, and eventually, to other agencies within the U.S. government. So I was pen testing and doing ethical hacking, is more like what we called it back then, almost 30 years ago. I came out into the private sector for many reasons a little over 25 years ago. Initially was helping companies as a security architect, still doing ethical hacking, pen testing. Back in those days, it was, let us break into your network and we'll tell you where all the holes are so that you can close them up and start establishing something that in those days we called internet security. Very much perimeter based, very much based on classic DoD military ideas of defense, which has to do with castles and moats and walls and firewalls and things like that. So I did that for a couple of years. Really got kind of disillusioned with pen testing back around 2003 or so, a little bit before I got involved with PCI, and frustrated with it because I had lots of clients that I would go into every 6 months, do the pen test, and show them what their big issues, egregious here. It was really easy to break into you, and this is why, and find out it wasn't fixed 6 months later, 12 months later, and did a little bit of soul searching and thought, there's got to be a better way. It's not working to just simply say, hey, I got root. I'm back in those days, it was mostly Unix systems. I'm root on all your servers. I'm root on all your workstations. I've got the keys to the kingdom. I can do anything I want. And they're like, yeah, so what? So I took it upon myself to try to figure out a different way to sort of crack the nut and try to get companies and organizations to appropriately care about security. And about that time, I stumbled upon PCI. And when I was first presented with the version 1.0 of the PCI data security standard, which was in the fall of 2004, I was told, we're here, read this. We're going to be doing it. We're going to be doing assessing companies against this thing. And I read it and I'm like, yeah, this is pretty comprehensive. This covers about all of the things that you should be doing from a technology and process and people perspective of security. Yeah, this makes sense. I can make this work. And over the years, I kind of used PCI and my position as a QSA to get entree into companies and get the attention of companies to do security and do it right. Not always did they understand it, but and they certainly didn't understand security, yet alone PCI, but they knew they had to do it. And what I tried to do is try to give them context and understanding and explain, here's why you should be doing the things that PCI requires and how it all weaves together and works together, and why it's not good enough just to check the box, as most people know PCI, but make it make sense and make it reasonable so that organizations would be more likely to say, oh yeah, that makes sense. We're doing a lot of that anyway. The real challenge with PCI, as with many compliance regimens, is just proving that you're doing the things that you're doing. Of course, there's a lot of companies that aren't doing, and they spend a lot of time trying to move the shells around and try to deflect and make you look, don't look behind that curtain type of thing. But I ended up doing it for a long time, and I love PCI as a framework. I hate PCI as an ecosystem because it doesn't really address the problems that you're claiming that you want to try to address or at least discuss with your podcast, which is, how do you take security to the masses? How do you make security make sense to organizations at all levels and all types of organizations in all sorts of different verticals and markets and so forth? I sort of personally believe that security, like liberty, is something that should be for all. It should be available to all. And while PCI has impacted our industry in probably more ways than a lot of security hacker professionals would like to admit, it also really addresses only the 1%. And I have many pet peeves, if I'm honest. One of my pet peeves is that most of our industry primarily vendors, but often service companies and service providers, and all of us experts that like to get together and talk about things, we tend to focus on the enterprise, and that's just that many companies out there. Security doesn't change. Version 4 of the PCI standard was just published last week, end of March. It's still 12 major requirements. The overall structure of it hasn't changed, and the 12 requirements are based on 6 security goals. And I would argue that they haven't changed, and they don't change regardless of what business you're in, what industry you're in, what technology you're employing, the advances of technology. So much more being done elsewhere in cloud and serverless and all this, newfangled buzzwords that we have. And I'm an old timer. I'm grumpy. I'm a curmudgeon. Get off my lawn. But the fundamentals of security don't change. You have something you want to protect. You have secrets. You have business operations that you want to keep going. There's people that want to do bad things to you. There's people that want to steal your data just to make money. They don't care if it's you, but if you're vulnerable and they can steal it from you, they will, if they can make money off of it. There's an element of security that just never changes. So that's me. I did QSA to round out who I am. I did QSA for a lot of years. I had, almost 10 years ago at this point, I was lured into the vendor land. I went to work for a company called Tenable Network Security. They hired me as their PCI subject matter expert. And while I was there, they said, oh, by the way, we want you to go out and start speaking at conferences and kind of do the evangelism thing. So I got to meet and work with cool people like Jack Daniel and Space Rogue and Marcus Random, if anybody knows that name. We were the 4 evangelists at Tenable at the time. And Jack Daniel's really the one that kind of took me under his wing and introduced me to the community. And of course, everybody knows Jack, and now thanks to Jack, some people know me. But I found my own space, and I found people like to hear the stories of, in many cases, before they were born, where some old guy was doing pen testing, and there's value in the history, again, because the methodologies and the essential elements of security don't change. So I do a lot of conference speaking. I do a lot of trying to network with people, mentor, teach. I've been involved with this other podcast called Paul's Security Weekly. Gosh, I've been doing that for 8 years now. And ironically, to sort of close out this opening segment, if we have any time left in the podcast, up until December, I had my own show over at the Security Weekly Network called Security and Compliance Weekly. And our logo was very similar to yours. It has a bridge. Our motto was we were trying to build bridges and tear down silos. We were trying to get the security world to talk together to the compliance world. Because I live in both worlds.
I swear, there's no relationship there. I swear to God, that is completely unintentional, but at the same time, awesome. So I mean, I'm like, here I'm sitting here, like, so you went from 3-letter agency to 3-letter industry, and
yeah, I can't handle much more than 3 letters at a time.
I mean, if you haven't seen it all, you've seen a bunch. I feel like you were looking at me too, and you talked about things that were going on before I was born. But I'm a little older than that, but not by much. No, and it was at a conference that I first met you. That was GrrCon years ago.
Yep.
But so you have seen a lot. Right. Yep. And, as we talked about a little bit before the show, I was in financial services when PCI was really starting to become, quote unquote, a thing, and saw the best and worst of it, kind of the way you described. How did we end up, like, PCI gets that bad rap, right? Like, I mean, there's that, it's checkbox compliance. Is that because organizations approached it wrong? Is it because PCI did it wrong? Is it because the vendors who are counted on to be a part of that ecosystem got it wrong? Where do you feel we kind of veered that into?
Is that D or E? All of the above. Well, I think it's a couple things, and at some level it's not unique to PCI. I see a big difference between PCI and other compliance standards, but for the benefit of our listening audience, we can lump it together for at least a little while. In the yeah, I see things more from I started in the DoD working for an organization where our actual business was information security. That's all we did. And oh, by the way, we were the only game in town. If you wanted any kind of secure communications equipment, you came to NSA, at least if you were part of the DoD, the military, State Department, anything that involves secrets. We were, and NSA is still, largely responsible for the security of communications. Maybe that's changed now with DISA and CISA and all these other, Department of Homeland Security. I left the government. I don't pay much attention to it, but in the real world, in the private sector, in the early days, the companies that got it are the ones that in the early days were most likely to suffer loss. And those were organizations that had to do with money. So obviously financial services and banks, got the education early. Not always because they were doing it for the right reason. Very often it was because they had suffered some sort of a loss. But in the early days, it was, what are the bad guys going to do? They want to steal money. So let's protect it. And very closely tied to that was, stealing credit card information as a way to monetize things, because the bad guys were motivated to make money. Nowadays, fast forward 30 years or so, it's all ransomware and things like that, where again, it's just a way to make money. They don't really care that they've knocked out a bank or a hospital or a school. They just found some place that was vulnerable, and they try to do their ransomware and get paid and move on. It's a business at some level. But I think what's the mistake is severalfold. One is organizations largely don't understand and don't have to do security for a lot of industries. PCI is, for better or for worse, but one of the good things about it is it held a lot of companies' feet to the fire to say, no, you have to do security. If you're going to be dealing with our stuff, our credit cards, you're going to have to do this list of security standards and have somebody come in and rate you on how well you're doing it. And by the way, it's 100% pass fail. There is no grade in PCI, at least in theory. But because PCI has been so stringent, one of the struggles with it is because it's so difficult to be 100%. Companies figured out relatively early on that they can make PCI go away if they start segmenting and compartmenting and isolating the systems in their networks that are subject to PCI assessment.
Guilty
Now,
charged. Yes.
Well, and it's a catch-22 for me, because while I think the motivation is wrong, you shouldn't dodge doing basic security. You should be able to stand up and show me that you're doing some of the basic things. But in order for them to segment and declare, here's a small corner of our network, and that's what in PCI speak is the cardholder data environment, or the CDE. For you to be able to declare that, you have to show me all the network diagrams. You have to show me data flows. I get to go around and talk to everybody and find out what all the business processes are that might possibly touch credit card information. And basically, you have to clean up your act. So the effective thing that was happening was people were reducing their footprint. All this data that was in a million different places in their organizations and on their networks and on there, it was in places that had no business being there. It all got cleaned up and got reduced. In fact, a lot of companies figured out, oh, we don't need to keep the credit card information at all. And if we do that, PCI mostly goes away. Woohoo, bonus. Now, what I hate about that is it concerns me, because there isn't anything in the PCI data security standard, any of the requirements that any company shouldn't be doing anyway,
right?
With very few exceptions. So that always concerns me. But from the perspective of, you used to have 20 million cards in 13,000 locations in your network, and now you've reduced that down to one database in one enclave and one isolated network. You've made yourself more secure because you've made it harder for a bad guy to get to the data. But sort of the natural evolution, though, and I think, again, much related to PCI, in the early days, the conventional wisdom, the attacker wants to find the database, the storage of all the mother load of credit card data from transactions. If you're one of the early instances of compromise was like TJ Maxx. They were breached back in mid 2000s. 10, 20, $30 million credit cards stolen. The bad guys found where they were stored, and they went in and hauled them off. But even that attacker, that hacking ring that did that, they also hacked an organization called Heartland Payment Systems. Heartland Payment Systems, they were doing more of what I would have called harvesting. They were getting it out piecemeal, trickling it out. And that's kind of where the paradigm of the attack method has shifted over the years. So like, get into now 2013, 14, 15, where it was Target and Home Depot. They weren't finding the mother load. They were installing malware that was picking off the cards one at a time at the cash registers as the transactions were happening, and compiling them and then dumping them out, or they were, exfiltrating them a little bit at a time. That's a very different paradigm, and that's a very different thing that's harder to detect in terms of hacker activity or breach activity. And we struggle to keep up, I think, with the paradigms, the attack methodologies. So fast forward today, we're struggling as a society to keep up with ransomware, because so many companies are being hit by organizations, I should say, are being hit by ransomware that have been largely ignored by the industry because there's no money in it for them, because they don't have the budgets, because they're not enterprise, they're not financial services, they're not the banks, they're not insurance companies. They don't have these huge budgets. They're not the big retailers to do all the security things and buy all the products. They're municipalities, they're struggling banks, hospitals, medical centers, and stuff like that, where there's no budget, so there's no security. I'm generalizing, and there's really nobody that wants to go after that segment of the world and try to help them, because nobody's benevolent. Nobody wants to do it. At the end of the day, we're all in this to make money, right? I mean, we work for a company, and we're for profit, so we have to make a business. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, "Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Jeff, but there's no money in it, so we're not interested."
No, that's legit. I mean, it did spin up some new business, right? I mean, we've now got these payment concentrators who, take on and proxy a lot of that payment activity for those small companies. So here, you don't have to get PCI compliant, because you just farm off all your card transactions to us. We'll maintain compliance, and you just pay us a fee to do that. So, one of the things I remember from my early days dealing with PCI, and this phrase will stick in my mind forever, was the intent of the requirement. Was a phrase that came up more times than I can remember. And I feel like, well, that maybe shed the light on some initial issues. It also showed us that maybe there were things about, the requirements, whether it's PCI or any other, that just didn't really connect with kind of either business values or, kind of things that, ultimately the business saw, a value in or could connect to their practices. And that's why they were almost kind of trying to reshape it. And we had QSAs in particular that I worked with anyway, who were very receptive to the idea of defining the intent of the requirement. So I'm kind of curious from your perspective, how do you, when you hear that sort of thing, I mean, is that something that you've dealt with? Is that something you agree with? Or is there something more we should be doing to kind of address the way that we can sell this to the business as a valuable thing?
I mean, I've certainly encountered it and lived it, and I usually characterize it as not intent, but I say spirit of the requirement rather than letter of the law. But that's one of the big things that I think I've humbly have had some success at as a QSA over the years is helping organizations not only understand the intent but understand the context. In the early days of the PCI standard, I actually. You won't find this online, but I have a hard copy of version 1.0 of the PCI data security standard that I still use as a reference item. It was very terse. It's like, here's the requirement, do this, with the little explanation. Now, over the years, they've learned to add more guidance, more context, more they have a testing requirement, what the QSA is supposed to do. Here's the requirement. Here's what the QSA is going to do to see if you're doing what the requirement says. And all of that helps. But and they've got other, they've got FAQs, they've got all sorts of different guidance out there. Every year they have special interest groups that get together, SIGs, and they focus on a topic and try to come up with, sort of a deep dive best practice recommendations. But that's that's what I like to do, is I like to explain to companies, this is what the thing means. I'm trying to think of a good example. One of the ones that most of the people in at Tenable, when I went there, they're familiar with is there's a quarterly external vulnerability scanning requirement, and it has to be done by a certified independent organization. Well, telling you to have a quarterly external vulnerability scan doesn't really say a whole lot. And then constituting what's a passing or failing scan, and PCI requires passing. What does that mean? What constitutes a pass or a fail? There's all sorts of nuance. Maybe this isn't a great example, but I mean, in version 4, one of the things that's new about version 4 is the council has finally put out a table that clarifies what they mean by quarterly. Because we've had, I don't know if you've experienced it, I've experienced it over the years. Well, does quarterly mean once within a quarter? So I could scan on January 1st and then again on June 30th, but I've got a scan in Q1 and a scan in Q2, but effectively you haven't scanned anything in 6 months. They've tightened up the definitions to try to say, no, we really mean like once every 90 days at least. And of course, many organizations, from an internal perspective, scan daily, weekly, sometimes hourly. Of course, the vendors these days have continuous scanning turned on. So, technology has sort of evolved maybe a little bit ahead of the requirement. But the intention is, and this is, I think, important. Most people think the intent of a vulnerability scan is to find vulnerabilities. And I say, no, that's not exactly. Yes, to some degree. But the vulnerability scan, the way it's placed in the middle of the PCI data security standard, which is all the way down in requirement 11, it's really supposed to be a safety net. It's supposed to make sure that all these other things that you're doing, hardening systems, configuring your systems, patching your systems, knowing what your systems are, keeping an inventory, checking network flow, access controls, file integrity monitoring, intrusion detection, all these other things. And then you do a vulnerability scan just as a safety check to see what's fallen through the cracks. That's, to me, what it's about. And maybe that's subjective, but that's the nuance that's more than just simply, go find vulnerabilities. Now extend that to pen testing and the annual pen testing requirement, and that's triggering. Maybe we shouldn't go there.
I hear that. But you bring up, and that this is like a crucial point, and I love this because it is the truth, right? I mean, your vulnerability management in general really is meant to be a validation, I should say vulnerability scanning is meant to be a validation of what should be a comprehensive vulnerability management program that includes your patching program, what are you doing within your development pipelines, things like that are meant to be keeping those vulnerabilities from ever showing up anywhere. And the scanning, the pen testing, whatever it is, should be just your validation of that fact. So
I'm not saying you're wrong here, but I do want to highlight something. No, it's not that you're wrong, but it's Maybe it's PCI that's wrong. PCI, I mentioned they have 6 goals and 12 major requirements. One of the 6 goals is have a vulnerability management program. Within that thing that's labeled vulnerability management, there's 2 requirements, requirement 5 and requirement 6. Requirement 5 is the antivirus, anti-malware requirement. Requirement 6 is the one that has patching, change control management, secure application development. That's all under the umbrella in PCI terms of vulnerability management. The scanning comes several goals later where it says monitor everything. Paraphrasing, but it's monitor your systems, and basically I usually say do all the security things. So vulnerability scanning in that context, while I said it's a validation, it's not part of a vulnerability management program the way PCI lays it out. I'm not saying they're right, I'm not saying they're wrong, but it's a different way of looking at it. And the argument I used to have with people at Tenable was, you might see it differently, and you might consider your products to be vulnerability management tools, but you've got this large client base out there that's doing this because of PCI. You ought to at least learn their language and be able to, put what you're doing in terms of your capabilities with your products into the language that if either they understand or their QSAs understand, so they can connect the dots and be compliant and get their box checked. And I don't work at Tenable anymore. Let's put it that way.
Neither does Jack, by the way, but that's a different story for another time.
Another time.
But and you highlight something also that's kind of interesting, right? Like even right or wrong, whether how I put it was right or the way PCI looks at it, it's right. I like the way they look at it because I appreciate that, and I think that that's kind of a key. And I'm sure you've probably encountered this too, when you try to get people in this industry to see beyond, right? To see beyond how we've talked about it for the last 30 years or these traditional viewpoints, you actually get active blowback, or at least I do. And I'm curious, do you experience the same? And what are some of those things that, like, if there was a message you could get people just to look at it differently or hear you on, I mean, what's out there?
Well, no, I don't think I get blowback the way you get blowback. And maybe that's just because I don't put myself out there in the same way that you do. Maybe it's because I'm right and you're wrong. There's any number of reasons. Maybe my delivery is different. I think if there was something I wanted to convey to your fledgling, burgeoning audience here, and to try to address, what you've described as the theme is, which I largely agree with, how do you get the security message across to more and different, within organizations as well as organizations in general. The only pushback I would give to you, at least for now, I'm sure I can come up with more, is and it's subtle, but cybersecurity, the people that do cybersecurity within an organization, I think you would agree, need to get over themselves. And I think you've said that, but part of that is also I guess sort of trying to flip things around, because the way you phrased it still makes it sound like cybersecurity is at the middle and you're trying to reach out and pull people into your way of seeing things, which again, I largely agree with. But if you're on the outside looking in, you're not going to hear that as well as I think, and this is as much theory as anything, trying to figure out a way to convey the message that we're trying to convey, but in a way that they're going to hear it and not make it sound like we're talking down to them or we're, simplifying things or speaking, I joke all the time about, if you want to talk to senior level management, you got to do it with small words and use a lot of pictures, that type of thing, which, it's good for a laugh, but it doesn't really help if one of the people you're trying to communicate with is listening to me say this and
right.
Is that what he's doing? Is that why the words are, like I said, 3 letters, not much more than that. But I have very often in my career described myself, since I came from a technical background, did a lot of pen testing. I did other stuff besides pen testing at NSA, actually a certified cryptanalyst. So I used to break codes as well as make codes, design systems. But I went away from that and started working with the rest of the people in organizations. And I like to describe myself as being bilingual. I can sit down with the techies and the developers and the admins and the hackers and all the cybersecurity people and talk shop with them and hang with them. I don't do it mostly anymore, but I can hang with them in the conversation. I can dazzle them with my knowledge of crypto. But I can also turn around and talk to the accounting office, the finance office, the lawyers, senior levels of management of all levels, operations. I go into lots of different types of companies. PCI isn't just stores, retailers. It's just about everybody does PCI. And I have the ability to speak in the language of whoever I'm talking to. And that's something that I've tried to, in the last couple of years, as I've become, sort of publicly known, I've tried to convey that as much as anything is I call it the art of the Jedi mind trick, but learning how to communicate this message to others in a way that they'll actually hear and actually you're really trying to elicit response. That's what all of us are trying to do. We're either trying to get our management to spend more money or change their ways, or the organization in general to do something different. But it's persuasive speech when you get right down to it. And there's tips and techniques and methods that are more successful than not. And there isn't one size fits all. Where I am probably, I'm not expert, I'm just more experienced. I've done a lot of practicing because I meet lots of different people and I have to adapt the message to them based on what I'm learning from them and reading from them. In fact, one of the most important points or elements of effective communicating, I believe, is listening, active listening. And listening involves more than just hearing, it's watching. Of course, I'm old, where I actually used to talk to people in person. I'm still trying to figure out how to translate active listening into social media, and there's this whole language of emoticons and emojis and everything, and I don't know if I'll ever get there. But people will say, and they'll rattle off 3 or 4 different emoticons, and that's supposed to mean something. I don't get that. But what I do get is learning how to read people, and I just have lots and lots of different types of methods, and try one, works, great, move on. Doesn't work, try something else. Doesn't work, try something else. Doesn't work, try something else. A simple example I give that most people can relate to is we've probably all done this. If you ever meet someone that's deaf, do you have a tendency to talk louder in trying to communicate with them? Or someone that speaks in a foreign language, they don't understand English. We happen to be speaking English. Do you tend to talk, or have you heard somebody talk louder and slower? And like, if I hear somebody speaking, let's say Russian, I don't speak Russian. They can speak as loudly and slowly as they want to. I'm not going to understand a word they're saying.
No, not at all.
I've got to find out another way to communicate. Anyway, so that's, I don't know if I've answered your question. I probably
it's totally legit, right? I mean, and that's the thing when we talk about even the whole bridges concept, which I mean, selfishly is because that's how I look at my role, and it's a lot of what you described.
Right?
How do I, connect with those people who aren't a part of security, who are the reason that I even exist in this role, right? I mean, if it wasn't for them, they're the thing that matters, and this is where I really wish we could get people in security to understand, like, look, even just take the risk conversation for a minute, right? You think about risk. CISOs love to talk about risk. Oh, I enable the business because I reduce risk. And we talk about, cybersecurity risk is this one little brick in this great big wall of risk that your organizational leaders, your CEOs, your COOs, your CFOs are looking at. And we, like, to your point, seem to think we're like the center of that universe, especially now that we're getting some more, understanding from boards and such. So yeah, I'm right there with you on that.
Well, let's riff on that a little bit and take that as an example. Risk. We all like, oh yeah, we understand risk. We know what risk is. Ask somebody to define risk sometime. Next time you're out at a hacker conference or gathering, just ask them, well, what does that word actually mean? And just watch it unfold. But to the degree that you're trying to speak to management and C-level people in organizations, to the degree that they understand risk, I will tell you they're understanding risk from a financial perspective, because that's where the term originally came from, at least in the private sector, in the commercial world. And it's been, I'm not saying risk wasn't a thing 30, 40 years ago, but it wasn't a thing in our marketing of security, because we didn't do any marketing back then. We were a one-stop shop. But it's something that's morphed into this business. And, I learned risk equations when I was working at the 3-letter agency. In fact, I was learning risk equations before I started breaking into computers and networks. So that was something that was part of, I worked for an organization that did evaluations of our own stuff. It was called Fielded Systems Evaluations. And it was based on somebody had the recognition, wow, we very often, NSA breaks the other guy's stuff because the other guy isn't using it correctly. They don't change default settings or default passwords. Key that's only supposed to be used one time or maybe for a week, they use it for a week or a month, and that introduces cryptographic vulnerabilities that makes it subject to compromise. But object misuse, finding bypasses and shortcuts, not following the instructions, all this stuff that is not an issue in today's cybersecurity world at all. But I'm talking about risk. Risk is a financial thing. We need to speak to it and understand it, not from our understanding of risk, but from their understanding of risk. And what I often do, what has worked for me in most cases, is to just try to simplify things and boil it down. If you Google a risk equation, you'll get hundreds, if not thousands, of very complicated algorithms and lots of math that I don't understand. But I will posit this. In the broadest sense, there's only 2 risks in a private sector commercial for-profit organization. One is the risk of the ability to earn revenue, and 2, the risk of how much is it going to cost to do the things that we need to do. So it's and that's a simple balance sheet, right? Assets and liabilities. But the bottom line is, how does this impact our ability to make money? So are we going to stop being able to make money, or are you going to slow us down, or how much is it going to cost to do the things that enable us to maintain our revenue stream? That's really all there is. So try putting all your conversations about cybersecurity risk in the context of, does this hinder our ability to make money, and how much does it cost? And see if maybe management doesn't sit up a little bit more. Okay, now you're talking something I understand, dollars and cents.
Yeah.
Just an idea.
Yeah. Hey, cybersecurity is going to save you money tangibly, right? I mean, I think we suffer there too. Sometimes that's a really lofty.
No, I didn't say ROI.
I know. The other one, but here's the thing. If you can show them how cybersecurity will actually help them make money, that's the effective one, right? Because
or not lose money.
Not right, but my point is, not lose money is that one. It's hard to quantify, even if you have like all the risk equations in the world, because you're saying, hey, my return on investment is making something not happen, right? Versus
dirty little secret. You can pay $1,000 for a pen test or $100,000 for a pen test and get hacked the next day. Shh.
Exactly.
Because that's the nature of the business.
And that's why I'm always, it's like, how do we talk about, if I'm going to say I'm the enabler of the business from security, it's got to be something more than, hey, that stuff you've already done a risk evaluation on, you've already invested. Yeah, I'm going to reduce the risk of that. Well, we're already down that road. We've already accepted that risk.
Right.
So what are you going to do that's going to be meaningful to me? Well, hey, I'm going to, open up a new revenue stream, or, give you a new market that you can evolve into. That's the stuff that's going to get, oh, hey, wait, what are you talking about now at the board level, right?
I think maybe people go into it thinking that they're trying to be enablers, and they end up being codependent. Just
that is absolutely the perfect way to put it. And unfortunately, I think I'm going to end on that, is because it is so perfect. Because I mean, we're at time. In fact,
you're out of time. Sorry.
Not surprisingly, I feel like we could go on for hours on this, and we probably will at some point. I'm sure we'll meet up at some conference and probably revisit some of this, and you'll tell me how insane I am, and I'll say, no, Jeff, you're wrong, but that's all right. But we got to go for now. So thank you again so much. I really appreciate it. Frank, I'm sorry. I did see you had a question there. We didn't get to it. Hopefully, we can kind of connect. We can talk about it later. Put it up on Twitter. Jeff will
I'll answer on Twitter.
So
Easy.
We'll take care of you. But so to everybody else out there, and including Frank too, I shouldn't make it sound like I don't include Frank. Thank you for tuning in. It's great to see all of you online again, checking us out. Remember, every week we go to podcast format a couple days later. Some new exciting news for you this week. We are now available on Apple Podcasts. So if you are the user of one of those crazy iOS devices and you like Apple Podcasts, you'll find us there now. The first 4 episodes are there. This one will be up probably Friday or Saturday. So you can check it out. And, we'll be right back here. We've got exciting guests coming up. I'm not going to tell you who next week is just yet, but we've got a really cool one coming up. So we're going to talk to someone from the vendor side next week. So I know, but it'll be good. I trust him. He's good.
And you can find me at Paul's Security Weekly at securityweekly.com.
Yes, absolutely. I've actually been on that show one time. So it was fun. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody for checking out Securing Bridges, and we'll see you again next week. We'll be right back here. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Securing Bridges podcast with Alyssa Miller. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.